Hi, imagine this. The wind claws at the thatch above you. The cold pushes through the walls like it owns the place. And you're lying shoulder to shoulder with half your family, plus a goat, all trying to make it through the night without freezing. In the medieval world, this wasn't unusual. It was Tuesday. Couples here had to be creative, turning cramped quarters and constant company into something that kept the spark alive, even when the fire burned low. Without a couple of blankets and a sharp wit, you'd never last. So before you tuck yourself in, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. But only if this kind of journey truly speaks to you. And in the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing the web of voices and places stretching across the world. Now, dim the lights, let that soft background hum roll in, and come closer. The night is waiting. And so is the story. It's the kind of night where frost doesn't just settle on the thatch. It seems to seep into your bones. The wattle and daub walls of your single-room home creak faintly under the strain of the wind outside. Everyone is inside. Children curled like commas in the straw bed. Grandparents lying so close, their breath warms each other's faces. A cousin who has been just visiting for 6 weeks now. You and your partner are here too, but not alone. Not ever alone. Privacy is a luxury for lords and for poets. For peasants, intimacy happens in plain sight, or not at all. The straw mattress beneath you rustles with every small movement, and the wool blanket is stretched thin across multiple bodies. Your partner's arm brushes yours, the contact deliberate in a way no one else notices. In a medieval household, touch is a language all its own. Bed curtains, if you have them, are nothing like the velvet canopies in tapestries. They're rough linen or even burlap, strung from a rope or pinned to the low rafters. They block sight but not sound, which is why couples learn to time their whispers with the cough of an elder or the snort of a tethered cow in the corner. Yes, the cow is indoors. Warmth doesn't care about propriety. Your modern thermostat is starting to sound like divine magic. Historical records tell us that in many villages, the copula carnalis, the physical consummation of marriage, was not just a private affair. In some communities, proof of the act was socially and legally necessary, and witnesses might wait outside the room, or room, to hear that the union was complete. There are documented cases of well-meaning relatives shouting advice through the wall. You pull your blanket up a little higher at the thought. The scent in the air is a layered thing. The tang of sheep's wool, the earthy musk of the packed dirt floor, the faint, acrid smoke from the hearth. Somewhere under it, all is the faint sweetness of dried rushes scattered across the ground. In the flicker of the low fire, your partner catches your eye. It's a brief glance, but heavy with meaning. You both know this dance, the art of saying everything without saying a word. Some historians argue that medieval people were less self-conscious about intimacy in shared spaces than we are today. Others insist there was always some level of modesty, even in the smallest homes. The truth is likely somewhere in between. You suspect that human embarrassment has existed as long as humans themselves, but so has the determination to carve out small sanctuaries of affection. The fire pops softly. Someone sighs in their sleep. You shift, letting your partner's hand brush yours under the blanket. It's not much, but in a room full of people, it feels like the most daring thing in the world. In a medieval home, dawn was not a gentle thing. It arrived like a cold hand shaking your shoulder. The air was heavy with smoke from last night's fire, but not enough to hide the bite of winter on your skin. There were no warm bedrooms to stumble from, and no kitchen waiting with hot coffee. The single room you shared with your entire household was dim, silent but for the creak of settling timbers and the faint sighs of people still sleeping beneath their heavy wool blankets. For most, the day began at the hearth. The same place meals were cooked, children were warmed, and stories were told in the evening. The hearth was the heart of the home, but also its stage. Anything that happened there was in view of everyone. Privacy was a rare commodity, measured in moments rather than spaces. And yet, for married couples, there was one daily ritual that sometimes allowed them to draw close without attracting notice. Baking bread. Bread was not an indulgence. For the medieval peasant, it was the foundation of survival, the one food everyone relied upon daily. It could be made from rye, barley, oats, or wheat if you were lucky. The process was long and physical, starting before the sun came up and ending when the first loaves were pulled from the fire's heat. The sourdough starter, or leaven, was the most valuable ingredient in the household. A small lump from yesterday's dough was kept alive overnight, hidden away from hungry children or curious animals. Without it, bread would be dense and flat, and the family's meals for days would be poorer for it. Because the bread was so essential, no one questioned the need to be at the hearth early, to work the dough while others slept. This was where opportunity hid itself in plain sight. A husband and wife might be the first ones awake, moving quietly in the cold, pulling flour from the chest and fetching water warmed the night before. They would stand side by side at the wooden trough, hands meeting in the heavy dough, and in that simple act find the only form of physical closeness the day might allow. In a shared home, touches had to be subtle, unremarkable to the casual observer. Hands in the same dough could brush without comment. A shoulder could lean into another as they both worked the stubborn mass, pressing and folding. One record from a 14th century rural court in England tells of a neighbour accusing a man and woman of being too familiar at the bakehouse. The accusation was that the woman's hands lingered on his while they kneaded, and that he smiled as though at a private joke. The court dismissed it. After all, who could say what had really happened? But it's a reminder that even the smallest contact could be noticed in close-knit communities. Yet couples took that risk. The heat of a partner's palm against yours, hidden by the excuse of working the dough, could carry more meaning than a kiss. Fingers might tangle for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. A thumb could brush against the inside of a wrist as flour was passed from one to the other. In a time when the church warned against excessive physical affection, even these brief contacts could feel thrilling. The bread-making process provided natural cover for low voices. The hiss of water hitting hot stones, the snap of the fire, the soft thud of dough against wood, all helped swallow the sound of murmured exchanges. One might lean in under the pretext of reaching for more flour, their cheek brushing the other's hair, their breath warming an ear in the chill air. A whispered promise, later behind the shed, could pass unnoticed if timed between the crackle of burning logs. In wealthier households, where bread might be made in a separate bakehouse, these moments could grow bolder. The bakehouse was often a small stone or timber building, apart from the main hall, its oven large enough to feed the whole manor. Servants might be present, but the noise and heat provided their own kind of isolation. A couple could slip into a shadowed corner while loaves bake it, hidden by racks of cooling bread. For poorer families whose baking took place in the same single room they lived in, secrecy demanded even greater precision. The moments came in fragments, a shared glance when someone's back was turned, a hand sliding briefly over another's waist while passing a pot. There are scattered mentions in medieval sources of couples using bread day as an excuse to be away from prying eyes. On market days, for example, one spouse might leave early to bake at a relative's or neighbour's hearth, taking the other along to help. No one would question it. Bread had to be made, and extra hands were welcome. In rural France, ethnographers have recorded 19th century traditions that may have echoed older practices. Engaged couples were sometimes allowed to bake together as a sign of their future cooperation in the household. Though supervised, such work gave them rare chances to speak freely and exchange small touches. Imagine two people walking together in the half-light to the neighbour's bakehouse. Their breath hangs in the air, boots crunching on frost. Inside, the oven's heat hits their faces, and the air smells of yeast and wood smoke. They work in a rhythm, shoulders brushing, each moment of contact unnoticed by the supervising aunt, because her hands are busy with her own batch of dough. The medieval church held strong opinions about when and how married couples should be intimate. Theologians insisted that sexual relations were for procreation only. Passion for its own sake was often condemned as sinful, and even affectionate speech could be criticised if it was thought to encourage desire. Confession manuals advised priests to ask about immoderate touching or fond words spoken in public, a husband caressing his wife's hair at the hearth, or a wife pressing close to her husband during morning chores, could be interpreted as improper if anyone else saw. This moral pressure meant that couples developed a kind of physical shorthand, a way to express closeness that appeared entirely innocent. Bread making, with its necessary cooperation and rhythmic contact, was one of the safest covers. By the time the dough had risen, the rest of the household was waking. Children began to stir, older relatives muttered under blankets, and the small room filled with the rustle of movement. Loaves went into the oven or onto hot stones to bake, the smell filling every corner. Breakfast would follow, bread torn and passed around, maybe with butter or a smear of honey if the household could afford it. Conversation would turn to the day's tasks, arguments over chores, or news from the village. Outwardly, nothing was different, but the couple would carry something unseen into the day, the heat of a hand against theirs, the echo of a quiet word, the memory of a look shared over the dough. These moments were like the leaven itself, small, unseen, but capable of making something larger rise and endure. In the crowded, noisy world of the medieval peasant household, such sparks mattered. There might not be another chance for contact until night, and even then, the sleeping arrangements meant there was always someone just inches away. The morning bread could be the one time when affection was possible without suspicion. Couples learned to savour it. The weight of the wooden spoon in both hands, the warmth of the hearth against a cold morning, the mingled scent of yeast and wool, all became woven into the memory of that brief closeness. The bread would feed everyone, but the moment would feed something else entirely. The quiet, stubborn intimacy that survived despite rules, watchful eyes, and the press of too many bodies in too small a space. The market was the busiest, noisiest, and most forgiving place in a medieval week. Everyone came, peasants with surplus eggs, merchants from nearby towns, craftsmen displaying their work, and gossip mongers sniffing for news. It was also the one public setting where a couple could blend into the movement, slip a touch or a word past 100 pairs of eyes, and leave no trace but memory. One trick was to arrive separately but orbit toward the same stall. A husband might be weighing barley at the grain merchant's while his wife examined apples 2 tables away. When she passed behind him, her hand would briefly rest on his back, not long enough to draw notice, but enough for him to feel the pressure through wool. Sometimes she would accidentally hand him the wrong coin, fingers lingering just a second too long before he corrected her mistake. Another tactic made use of the spice and herb sellers. These stalls were small islands of scent in the market's sea, rosemary, thyme, sage, and sometimes imported pepper. A man leaning close to smell the thyme could speak low into his wife's ear, his breath hidden in the perfume of the herbs. No one questioned 2 people standing shoulder to shoulder here, scent invited closeness. Records from a 14th century London market fine list mention unseemly jesting at a spice stall, proof enough that traders sometimes witnessed more than they admitted. Sometimes the meeting happened not in the square itself, but in the fringes. The narrow lane behind the tanner's shed, the shade of a cart piled with hay, the covered entry to a warehouse. A couple could slip away for the time it took to inspect the leather or check the quality of grain. These excuses were understood as trade business, and unless someone had a reason to follow, they provided 2 or 3 minutes of privacy. In some towns, the markets sat next to guild halls or churchyards. That gave another opportunity, stepping into the shade of a stone arch to avoid a sudden rain or to pray in the quieter side aisle of the church. While such actions carried risk, especially in view of the church's disapproval of public affection, they also offered thick walls and fewer witnesses. There were also silent codes. A scarf worn with the knots on the left might mean, "Meet me after midday by the west gate." A sprig of mint tucked into a basket handle could signal agreement. The way a wife carried her basket, close against her hip or balanced in the crook of her elbow, might serve as a prearranged answer to a question only her husband understood. These codes allowed couples to plan without a single spoken word. Wealthier couples had different tactics. A wife might claim to be visiting the cloth merchant to check a delivery, knowing her husband's stall was nearby. In busy trading cities like Bruges or Ghent, the press of international merchants meant that no one cared to track the movements of a single couple. They were just 2 more bodies in the crowd. In smaller villages, the cover had to be more precise, because everyone knew everyone else's business. Sometimes, the market rendezvous extended beyond the square. If both finished their errands around the same time, they could take the long route home, first apart, then closing the gap when they were beyond the last cottage. Hedgerows, mills, and wooded footpaths became extensions of the market's privacy. A man might pretend to lead his cart slowly to save the horse, allowing his wife to catch up. From there, a bend in the road or a patch of trees was enough for a few stolen minutes. Of course, the market's openness was also a danger. Village gossips had sharp eyes, and church courts occasionally summoned couples for indecent behaviour at market, often on nothing more than rumour. That risk made these encounters as much about cleverness as desire. A touch had to be quick, a word disguised, a smile hidden behind a bargaining face. The best couples were actors, their romance staged behind the props of trade. For many, these meetings were less about lust than about keeping a thread between them in a life crowded with duty and noise. A market day might be the only time in a week they could stand side by side without children clinging to their clothes or elders asking for help. The moments were small, but they were a signal. I see you. I have not forgotten you. And so, week after week, the market's chaos became their cover. Among fishmongers shouting prices and hawkers waving bolts of cloth, among the smell of smoke and the crush of feet, 2 people found each other, again and again. The signal might be a touch, a glance, a piece of mint, or a hand brushing over a purse of coins, but it was enough. Enough to keep the connection alive until the next market came and the dance began again. Harvest time was exhausting, but it was also one of the best chances for couples to disappear into their work without raising suspicion. Fields stretched beyond sight, the air smelled of earth and cut grain, and the rhythm of scythe and hoe made it easy to hide a whispered word or a passing touch. No one questioned why 2 people worked side by side. The more hands in one row, the faster the crop came in. One common trick was to volunteer for tasks at the far edge of the field. A husband might insist that his wife's skill with binding sheaves was too valuable to waste near the barn, sending her out where the wheat stood thickest. Out there, away from the overseer's eyes, there was room to pause between bundles, to brush dust from each other's shoulders, to steal a few seconds beneath the bent shadow of tall stalks. In vineyards, the opportunities multiplied. The rows of grapevines were narrow and winding, and the heavy leaves made small green tunnels. Picking grapes side by side meant arms brushing as they reached for the same cluster. A dropped basket could be the perfect excuse for both to kneel, their heads close, voices low under the rustle of vines. Medieval French court records even note cases where indecent familiarity was discovered in the vineyards, a reminder that not all harvest labour was entirely about fruit. Another harvest hack was to take advantage of tools. Hoe handles and rake kicks, when passed from one person to another, could mask a deliberate touch, a lingering grip, a palm pressed briefly against the other's. This was especially effective during haying season, when bundles had to be lifted and stacked. A man steadying his wife as she climbed onto a cart could let his hands rest a moment longer than needed. Threshing barns also had their uses. Once the cut grain was brought in, teams worked inside, beating the stalks to separate the kernels. The noise was deafening, flails striking in rhythm, dust swirling in golden clouds. In that din, a couple could talk without being overheard, stand close without anyone noticing, and even slip into a shadowed corner if the barn was big enough. For wealthier estates where harvest meant dozens of labourers, couples had to be more careful. A flirtation might be hidden in the division of work, one bringing water, the other helping to steady the bucket, one carrying tools, the other walking close enough that shoulders touched as they crossed the yard. Large estates also had orchards, where climbing a ladder together to pick apples created brief, private pockets of closeness, high above the ground. In some places, harvest festivals followed the work, a shared meal in the field, or a dance in the village square once the last sheaves were stacked. These were safer times for a little public closeness. Music and ale gave cover to laughter, a hand on a waist, even a quick kiss if the shadows were long enough. The church sometimes frowned on the excesses of such celebrations, but communities defended them as tradition. Couples developed unspoken systems to stretch their time together. If he rested his hoe with the blade pointing left, it meant meet me by the tree line when the water break comes. If she tied her apron in a double knot, it meant she could slip away after loading the cart. These signs, invisible to others, kept the day's small conspiracies alive. Even in the middle of back-breaking work, the harvest offered space for human warmth. The same hands that turned the earth or gathered wheat could find each other in a crowd, unnoticed but not unfelt. And when the season ended, when the fields lay bare and the tools were stored away, the memory of those moments were a laugh behind the haystack, a touch under the grape leaves, a whisper in the threshing barn, was carried into the long winter ahead. If a medieval home had an illusion of privacy, it usually came from two things: a curtain hung in the right place, or a well-stacked pile of straw. They were the walls that didn't exist, the locks that never turned, and couples learned to use them the way a street performer uses sleight of hand. In one village near York, a weaver's wife was famous for her winter curtains. She'd drape heavy woolen cloth from the rafters around their sleeping area, claiming it kept out draughts. In truth, it muffled the view from her mother-in-law's bed. Her husband once joked that their marriage depended on the loom. Without the thick cloth, they might as well have been kissing in the middle of the market. Neighbours copied the idea, though one farmer tried it with a fishing net, which did nothing but create an audience. In barns, straw was as good as stone walls, if you stacked it right. A young couple in Flanders discovered that by making a U-shaped pile, they could vanish into it like rabbits in a burrow. It worked perfectly until one afternoon, when a curious goat clambered up, toppled the stack, and exposed them to a passing cousin. After that, they started storing an extra basket of apples at the entrance, the goat's bribe. In wealthier homes, beds often had proper curtains, sometimes embroidered with flowers or family crests. These were meant for warmth, but they also gave cover for whispered conversations and whatever followed. One baron's daughter in Burgundy allegedly sewed bells into the bottom of her bed curtains, not as decoration, but as a warning system. If someone tried to pull them back, she and her lover would have time to rearrange themselves into a respectable pose. The household eventually noticed the bells and assumed they were simply a fashionable touch. Imagine standing in the dim glow of a single tallow candle, the smell of warm straw rising all around you, the curtain swaying just enough to brush your shoulder. Beyond it, you can hear muffled voices and the scrape of a stool, close but not close enough to stop you. Not all curtains were indoors. In cramped towns, laundry lines strung across narrow alleys could form temporary walls. A baker's apprentice in Bruges used to hang 2 enormous sheets between buildings when his sweetheart came to visit. To passers-by, it looked like laundry day. In the middle, hidden from the street, it was their own soft-walled room. One rainy day, the sheets got so heavy, they collapsed onto them mid-kiss, sending them sprawling into the mud in full view of a monk on his way to Vespers. Even without curtains, sound could be hidden. Some couples in colder climates piled straw so thick around their sleeping space that it created a kind of acoustic cocoon. It wasn't perfect, babies still cried, and the fire still popped, but it was enough to mask low voices and the soft creak of bedboards. Chroniclers rarely mention such arrangements, but in 15th century inventories, the amount of straw kept indoors is suspiciously high for just bedding. Curtains and the straw piles were fragile solutions. One tear in the cloth or a careless sneeze could undo the whole illusion. But for those who lived shoulder to shoulder with parents, siblings, servants, and even animals, they were better than nothing. In the quiet world behind a curtain or the warm hollow of a straw stack, a couple could pretend, for a minute or two, that the room, the house, even the whole village belonged only to them. Feast days were rare, bright interruptions in the grinding calendar of medieval life. They were excuses for food, drink, dancing, and, if you knew how to vanish, a little time away from the crowd. From dawn to dusk, the whole village became a stage, and somewhere between the church bells and the last song, couples found their gaps in the performance. Before the procession began, the communal ovens were a crush of heat and bustle. Women queued with loaves to be baked. Men came to help carry the heavy paddles. A mason's wife once slipped into the bakery with her husband to check the bread. They left an hour later with flour on their clothes, and one loaf conspicuously flatter than the others. The baker said nothing. He had his own reasons to like an unlocked side door. Church parades were long, and not everyone watched the whole thing. A young couple in Paris was once caught slipping away during the reading of the Gospel, ducking down a side street lined with stalls selling ribbons and sweets. Their excuse, looking for a gift for the priest, was just plausible enough to save them from public penance. After the feast meal, dancing began. A fiddler played until his bow frayed. Children darted between skirts. Men stamped their boots in the dust. Somewhere between songs, a farmer's daughter asked a visiting merchant to help fix her shoe in the barn. He returned alone, claiming she'd gone to fetch another pair. She reappeared later, hair slightly dishevelled, carrying 2 mugs of ale she swore she'd been getting all along. Travellers always brought stories and sometimes opportunities. At one feast in Norfolk, a pilgrim stopped to rest in a small lean-to near the green. A local woman offered him water. Her husband followed soon after, and the 3 disappeared inside. The talk later was whether the pilgrim was a convenient cover or an unexpected accomplice. Either way, the shed door stayed shut for quite some time. You pause near the edge of the village green, ale warm in your stomach, the sound of music and laughter spilling into the cooling air. Behind you, the glow of torches flickers against the walls of the barn. Somewhere inside, footsteps shift in straw, low voices muffled by the beat of the drum outside. No one calls your name. When the last fire was doused in the square, couples walked home together in small groups. It was easy to peel away under the pretense of seeing a friend to their door or checking on animals. In one village chronicle, a man lost his wife on the way home from the feast. She returned the next morning claiming she had stayed with her cousin. Her cousin, of course, had been in another town entirely. Feast days were perfect cover for small disappearances. The noise, the drink, the movement of bodies in and out of doors, all of it gave space for private moments to slip unnoticed into the public celebration. For most, those moments were as much a part of the feast as the bread, the ale, and the music that kept the night alive until the first pale light of morning. The day's noise thinned as the sun slipped behind the rooftops. The single hearth in the centre of the room glowed red, casting slow-moving shadows up the walls and across the low beams. The family's chatter, loud an hour ago, softened into murmurs. A pot of stew rested on the stones, its scent of onions and parsley mingling with the faint tang of smoke. In houses where everyone slept together, night didn't mean privacy. It meant learning to be invisible in plain sight. Couples waited for that moment when work was done, when the children's heads began to droop, and the older folks stared into the fire without speaking. A husband might sit beside his wife on the bench, their knees brushing under the table. Her hand would slide into the folds of her skirt, fingers reaching for his beneath the rough fabric. A connection, hidden by wool. On the far side of the room, another couple shared the same trick. They were younger, recently married, still stealing glances as if the vows hadn't made their closeness any less thrilling. He leaned forward to stir the pot, and as he passed the ladle, his other hand lingered at her hip. To anyone else it looked like balance, but she knew the weight of that touch. In wealthier homes, bed curtains offered a different kind of darkness. They could be pulled before the rest of the household slept, turning a corner of the room into a dim tent of privacy. The cloth muted the light, casting shapes that moved and swayed on the fabric. A 15th century French manual on household management even advised couples to keep a candle burning for comfort, though the reason for that comfort was left unsaid. You feel the warmth of the fire at your cheek, the air shifting as someone passes behind you. The candle on the table flickers, and in its unsteady glow you catch the curve of a smile, meant only for you. The sound of the room fades until all that's left is the slow rhythm of your own breath. Even without curtains, the shadows worked as allies. A wife might rise to fetch more wood, her husband following under the excuse of helping her carry it. In the darker corner, near the stacked logs, they could stand close enough to trade a few words or let his hand rest at the small of her back before returning to the light. Some families ignored these small vanishing acts. Others pretended not to see. In crowded households, everyone understood that desire had to live somewhere, even if it breathed in whispers and candlelight. And so, while the fire sank lower and the last words of the day dissolved into the crackle of embers, couples found their quiet space, not in a separate room, but in a sliver of shadow, a stolen pocket of warmth, a breath shared before sleep. If walls were thin or non-existent, sound had to do the heavy lifting. Medieval life came with its own orchestra, clatter, bleating, grinding, splashing, and couples learned the score by heart. They knew when the goats cried loudest, which hinge shrieked how long the quernstone took to sing a full circle. Every noise was a curtain if you stood behind it just right. The mill was the loudest instrument, a constant low thunder that rattled teeth. Lovers called its rumble the miller's cloak, because once the wheel caught the stream, it drowned almost anything. A carpenter and his wife, near the river, learned to time their whispered plans to the sluice gate. The moment the miller raised the board and water rushed through, they could talk in normal voices with no fear of a nephew lurking outside. If they needed more time, the miller, who had an understanding wife of his own, dropped a sack across the gear to make it knock and clack like a barrel band. A whole conversation could tuck inside that racket. Barns offered percussion. Think hooves on plank floors, iron shoes ringing on stone, cows blowing warm breath and stamping hay into hush. A couple in Suffolk turned cowbells into cover. Each night the wife scattered oats by the stool post, so the bell mare would shake her head just enough to keep a steady jingle. Under that tinkling camouflage, they swapped stories close enough to feel each other's words. Once the bell stopped, some thief had taken it, and the sudden silence was so sharp that both burst out laughing and had to pretend a sneeze fit to explain their red faces. Children made their own weather. Shrieks, foot races, giggles like spilled peas. Parents noticed the odd truth that the most reliable privacy came during noisy games. A mother sent her brood outside with a hoop and a stick, then slipped to the shed for kindling. Her husband followed, calling, "Mind the hoop," like a town crier. 10 seconds later, the shed door clicked shut. The kids never suspected. They were busy enforcing rules no adult could decipher. In some homes, parents deliberately taught clapping rhythms or tongue twisters, anything to keep the chorus going for 5 solid minutes. Laundry day was a drum line. Wooden paddles slapped wet linen against boards, water buckets thudded, and gossip bubbled. One laundress swore she could cover a full whispered argument behind the slap-slap of sheets alone. Her trick: misfold a damp sheet so she had to refold it 3 times, adding an extra minute of steady percussion. "If the sheet sounds angry, the aunties keep talking," she joked, because nothing excites neighbourhood commentators like the suspicion of a wrinkle. Blacksmith forges roared and sang. A hammer on anvil is thunder with edges, and apprentices used it as a metronome for mischief. A smith's daughter kept a rule: 2 clean strikes, 1 pause, safe to step close, 3 rapid blows, someone is entering. She and her husband learned to read that tempo better than church Latin. Once a travelling friar wandered in mid-whisper. The apprentice saved them by faking a shoeing emergency, so dramatic that the friar fetched water, while the couple drifted apart like smoke. In crowded townhouses, the stair was a spy. It squealed. Families turned squeaks into signals. 1 squeak, child. 2, aunt. No squeak at all. Danger. Someone using the kitchen ladder to surprise you. A tanner's wife secretly rubbed mutton tallow into the 3rd stair to control the pitch, turning an unpredictable groan into a neat, reliable chirp. She joked they had a singing staircase, and the song told her when her husband could slip a hand into hers as he passed with a water skin. Village sounds were seasonal. In spring, frogs in the drainage ditches made a nighttime static so thick you could hide a full confession in it. Summer crickets covered late porch murmurs. Autumn brought threshing rhythms, flails beating grain in perfect unison, a communal drum that masked soft talk from the barn doors to the cider press. Winter, ironically, was the quietest, which is why people invented noise, rattling pans to scare spirits, slamming shutters against the wind, and tossing salt on the hearth so it popped while you nuzzled a familiar shoulder behind the chimney breast. There were purposeful noises too, decoys made to order. One couple kept a sack of chestnuts by the hearth. When they needed a moment, they tossed a few onto embers. The nuts crackled, children cheered, and everyone leaned in to listen, giving the pair 15 blissful steps of invisibility along the shadowed wall to the door. A cooper, ever practical, made a hoop that squeaked when rolled. He gave it to the noisiest nephew in Christendom and blessed him as a personal bodyguard of sound. Comparisons helped them plan. Silence was like frost, it killed all the small flowers. Whispers, giggles, the breath you share at a cheek. Noise was rain. It didn't hide you, but it made every shape blur just enough. A husband would say, "Shall we wait for rain?" And his wife knew he meant the mill or the forge or the laundry slab, whatever weather the day could offer. Animals were allies with their own schedules. Hens cackled after laying, a reliable racket. Geese hissed at everything. Pigs enthusiastically rearranged the universe at feeding time. A pigsty, of all places, hid a quick kiss better than any chapel alcove. One pair even trained their dog to sing on command. Really just a well-timed howl triggered by a pocket tidbit. So their soft talk behind the door rode safely inside canine music. And yet the most dependable cover was the curtain. Grinding grain at home, stone on stone, was the daily low hum that permitted the softest indiscretions. Women who handled the curtain found they could hum along, turning two sounds into one. A midwife remarked wryly that half the babies in this parish owe thanks to the sound of flour being made, which is probably an exaggeration, but not by much. You crouch by the mill race, the wheel thundering inches from your shoulder. Spray kisses your cheek. The wooden housing shivers under your palm. When the sluice opens, the river's roar swallows your name so completely that you could shout it into your lover's ear, and the world would hear only water. Noise could also be a shield against misinterpretation. In households where elders shared the same room, affection had to look like work. A wife would say, "Listen, kettle's about to sing," and lean very close to hear better. A husband would reply, "Bellows are weak," and stand behind her at the forge, arms around, showing how to work the leather. When challenged, they could point to the sound itself, objective, practical, and the moment dissolved into usefulness. Sometimes the plan backfired. A monk visiting a manor thought the family's cheerful argument was cover for sin and demanded an inspection. He found only a cat trapped in a grain chest and a grandmother enjoying the floor show. A reeve misheard a couple's stage whisper behind a cider press and fined them for public levity, which the village found hilarious for a month. Sound could hide you, yes, but it could also trick a fool into thinking he'd seen what he'd only imagined. The church, for its part, preached moderation and decorum. Manuals warned against immodest touching in the hearing of others, which left couples to wonder what counted as hearing in a home that never truly slept. Communities quietly settled on their own compromises. If work was done, and no one cried out, the noises of life, mill, forge, barn, children, were allowed to stay music, not evidence. The most beautiful trick was a duet. Two lovers shared a task that required synchronized sound, pounding linen, treading grapes, turning the butter churn, and used that rhythm to talk in code. Tap, tap, slow tap, silence. Yes. Later, now not safe. It was Morse without dots, just a grammar of daily labour, and nobody else cared to translate. In the end, couples didn't fight the noise. They learned its grammar and spoke through it. They arranged their closeness in the pauses between hammer strikes, in the breath between a hen's cackle and a child's shout, in the steady hush of grain becoming flour. Sound was not merely camouflage, it was the city walls of their small country, built fresh every morning, crumbling every night, and rebuilt again the next day, with the first goat bleat, the first bucket splash, the first wheel creak that said, "You have a minute, go." Illness in a medieval household was never a private matter. The sick lay where everyone could see them, in the family's one bed, if they had it, on straw pallets if they didn't. Parents, children, servants, and sometimes animals moved freely in and out. Yet sickness created an unusual shield, a reason for long, uninterrupted proximity. A wife could sit at her husband's side for hours, smoothing his hair, wiping his brow, adjusting blankets, and no one would suggest she had any purpose beyond care. A husband could clasp his wife's hand in the open daylight, his thumb tracing her palm under the unquestioned cover of concern. Some of the most tender memories couples kept came from these vigils. In a manor near Ghent, a miller's wife nursed her husband through a winter fever. She brought cloths warmed by the fire, fed him sips of ale and broth, and sat beside him long after he drifted to sleep. The household saw duty. The two of them knew it was also something more. When he recovered, he teased that the fever had been worth the price, earning himself a half-hearted swat from her pillow. Illness could be an excuse to be alone. A man might watch over his wife, sending everyone else away under the guise of guarding her rest. In the privacy of a dim corner or behind the heavy folds of a bed curtain, they might exchange murmured plans for the future, or simply sit in shared silence. A tailor's apprentice in London, newly wed, faked the need for constant spoon-fed broth so his wife could stay beside him. Between mouthfuls, her lips brushed his as she checked the temperature. Their landlady, watching from across the room, assumed they were discussing the price of wool. But not all sickroom intimacy was gentle or wanted. In most of medieval Europe, marriage law, both secular and church, granted a husband the right to sexual access to his wife, regardless of her mood or condition. Priests preached that wives owed their husbands the marital debt, just as husbands owed it to their wives, though in practice enforcement was unequal. Chroniclers record cases of husbands insisting on consummation even during illness, framing refusal as sin. In a 14th century case from York Ecclesiastical Court, a wife's plea of weakness after childbirth was dismissed. The court ordered her to resume due service to her husband within days. The church officially frowned on sexual relations when one spouse was gravely ill, especially if the illness was contagious. Penitentials warned that such acts could impede healing or risk the soul if performed near death. Yet confessions hint that many couples ignored this, treating the sick bed as their only chance for closeness in a crowded house. In some sermons, priests scolded husbands who disturbed their wives under the pretext of care. Still, moral guidance carried less weight than daily habit, and in some marriages the sick bed became another contested space between desire and refusal. Even in wealthier homes, with separate chambers, the sick were rarely alone. Servants brought food and remedies, garlic wine, boiled sage, crushed beetles. Priests stopped in to pray over the patient. But visitors left gaps in their watch, and couples learned to stretch those gaps into something more. A noblewoman in Dijon famously sent her maid on impossible errands for saffron or cinnamon, knowing it would take hours. Whether she spent that time in whispered affection or endured the unwelcome attentions of her husband depended on the marriage. You kneel by the straw mattress, the air thick with the scent of rosemary sprigs stuffed into the bedding. The skin beneath your palm is warm, but not dangerously so. Outside, a cart rattles past the shutter, but here the sound is muffled. The world has narrowed to the slow rhythm of breathing, and eyes meeting yours in the candlelight. In poorer cottages, sickness meant closeness simply for warmth. There was no extra bed, no heated chamber. A healthy spouse might lie beside the sick to keep them from shivering through the night. Sometimes children were sent to neighbours to prevent contagion, leaving the couple briefly alone. An unexpected gift in a life of constant crowding. In kind marriages, these nights were about comfort. In unkind ones, they were an opportunity taken regardless of consent. Folklore and gossip contain hints of both, whispered praise for the husband who held his wife all night through a fever, and sharp veiled warnings about the man who could not keep still hands in the dark. During epidemics, the stakes were higher. The Black Death brought strict prohibitions against marital intimacy while one partner was ill. Priests warned it was both mortal and moral danger. Still, some refused to keep apart. A diary from plague-struck Siena records a man who would not leave his wife's side even as she worsened. He died days after her. To neighbours, it was either proof of devotion or folly. To him, perhaps both. Most of the time, sickness was more ordinary. A fever, a swollen joint, a winter cough. These were the days when couples could claim each other's time without raising suspicion. A wife could rest her head beside her husband's, claiming to listen for his breath. A husband could hold her hand for hours, supposedly checking her pulse. In that stillness, the world beyond the bed seemed far away. The noise of the yard, the gossip of the neighbours, the clang of the market bell. All that mattered was the weight of the blanket, the warmth of the other body, and the brief sense that, for this night at least, the room belonged only to them. The path to the mill was rarely just a walk. In the villages where houses pressed against each other like books on a shelf, the road out, where the dirt track, meadow path, or frozen ruts, was the first real breath of space. It wound away from the noise, from the eyes that saw too much, into a stretch of world where only you and the one beside you could hear each other's voices. Grain had to be milled, no one questioned that. A wife could sling a sack of barley over her shoulder, her husband take the other end, and the two would set off together. In theory, the point was efficiency. 2 people to carry, 2 to return. In practice, it was the most reliable excuse for half a day's privacy. Couples learned to walk slowly, letting the sack sway between them like a pendulum marking stolen minutes. Some made detours on purpose. There's a story from a hamlet near Bruges about a pair who always took the long meadow way in spring, claiming the bridge was washed out. Neighbours noticed the bridge was mysteriously fine every year, but no one called them out. Perhaps because everyone had their own version of the long way round. The road had its own company. You might meet other couples, traders with packs, shepherds driving their flocks, or children running errands. Passing wagons could shield a quick exchange of touches, fingers brushing over the grain sack, a palm pressing briefly at the small of the back. Sometimes travellers paused together under a hedge to let a cart pass on the narrow path. One mason's wife later laughed that her first child was conceived between hedge and wheel on such a day. Folklore painted mills as slightly enchanted places. The constant turning of the wheel was said to confuse evil spirits who could never count the rotations. Lovers liked the idea. It meant what they said on the mill road was safe from curses and ill luck. Some even paused halfway to exchange tokens, a ribbon, a carved button, believing the mill's turning would bind their promise. Millers themselves saw plenty. A seasoned miller in Norfolk kept a small bench out back for waiting customers, though everyone knew some couples took much longer than it took to grind a single sack. He claimed the bench was to keep people out of the rain, but one sharp-eyed neighbour swore she saw more warm embraces than damp cloaks there. You step off the main path, the sack strap biting lightly into your shoulder. The meadow grass is damp, brushing your ankles. In the distance, the wheel turns with its deep wooden groan, but here it's just birdsong and the sound of your own boots on soft earth. The air smells faintly of flower, and when your companion leans close to say something, their voice seems impossibly clear. Practical tricks kept the walk theirs. Some couples staggered their pace so one partner always had to catch up, giving reason for little stops in shaded spots. Others pretended to adjust the sack strap or check for tears, which meant setting the load down. Twice, sometimes 3 times, while they lingered in the quiet. Gossip could be both risk and thrill. In some villages, the mill road was so famous for courtship and intrigue that mothers warned daughters not to accept the sack unless they were ready for marriage. One widow in Kent was seen making the walk with a young cooper 3 times in a month. By the 4th, the neighbours assumed a wedding was imminent. They were wrong. It was just that he made the best jokes on the road. Not all mill walks were romantic. Sometimes the load was too heavy, the weather foul, and conversation turned to chores and debts. But even those trudges had a certain privacy, a space to speak freely about the things you couldn't say within earshot of family. Arguments were aired there, reconciliations too. The sound of the wind through the hedgerows carried words away without storing them for later use. In winter, when snow lay on the track, the trip was slower. Couples wrapped themselves in cloaks, leaning together for warmth as they trudged toward the creak and splash of the wheel. Once inside the mill house, the heat from the grindstones was a shock after the cold. People lingered by the meal troughs, cheeks flushed, hair damp with steam. More than one miller joked that his busiest season was also his most distracting. Some villages had 2 mills, giving a choice of direction. Couples quickly learned which road offered better cover. The one with thick hedges, the longer one by the brook, the one where the path narrowed so much you had to walk close. Even a short hand clasp, hidden by the sack between you, felt different when the only witnesses were crows in the field. And then there were the returns. Coming back with fresh ground flour meant a lighter load, a spring in the step. The work was done, the excuse fulfilled, but the last stretch of road was often the slowest. You could see the rooftops ahead, hear the faint bark of a dog or the call of a child, but neither of you hurried. The world outside the mill road could wait a few more minutes. By the time the path spilled back into the village, faces returned to their usual shapes, hands to their proper places. The grain went to the storehouse, the flour to the kitchen, and the walk was filed away in memory, not for the grind, but for the space between steps. The church was the one building in the village where no one questioned your presence. You could walk through the doors at almost any hour, at least during daylight, and no one would ask why. Prayer was assumed. Anything else, if noticed, was dressed in silence. A merchant's daughter in York swore she learned to read just so she could copy psalms in the porch because it gave her a reason to sit there every afternoon with a certain young cooper. His excuse was repairing a loose hinge on the door. The hinge took nearly a month to fix. Confessionals themselves were thin-walled things in most parishes, more screen than wall, but people learned to make them work. In Rouen, a miller's wife was known for confessing in the same stall every week, while her husband waited at the altar rail. The priest suspected nothing. A travelling baker on the other side of the screen had been arranging grain deliveries with her for over a year. No one ever asked why she returned from confession smiling. Churchyards were even easier. Graves made good cover. People avoided standing too close unless they had business. A shepherd courting the reeve's daughter used to meet her under the oldest yew tree by the Lich Gate. They always carried bread or apples, so if anyone passed they could offer it as charity, for the soul of the departed. One old woman said she prayed for the dead more in those years than in all her youth. Pilgrimage routes multiplied opportunities. To walk a holy road was to blend into a crowd of strangers, some devout, some curious, some looking for a change of air. Couples joined processions to nearby shrines, leaving together before the return. Once on the road to Canterbury, a weaver and his wife claimed they were staying overnight to hear the dawn mass. The innkeeper, sharp-eyed but discreet, placed them in the farthest loft room and charged them double for the trouble. You stand just inside the nave, cool stone under your feet, the sound of your own breath loud in the hush. The candlelight dances along the carved saints. casting deep shadows in the folds of their robes. Beside you, your partner leans in, close enough for the faintest brush of cloth to cloth, and murmurs something meant for no one else in this holy place. Markets after high mass were another excuse. The church square filled with traders as soon as the last bell rang. A woman could buy candles for her household and meet her husband by the butter stall without anyone thinking twice. They might walk the length of the row together, speaking in low voices under the noise of bargaining. In the bustle, even a hand resting a moment too long on an arm went unnoticed. Some churches encouraged long hours inside, especially on feast days when relics were displayed. Relics drew crowds, and crowds made it easy to lose yourself in the shifting bodies. One record from a priory in Lincoln tells of two visitors lingering so long at the display of a saint's finger bone that the sacristan tapped them on the shoulder. They claimed to be praying for fertility. The sacristan, perhaps wisely, did not inquire further. Clerics sometimes played along. In smaller parishes, the priest knew everyone's business. A kindly one might, accidentally, take the long way around the cloister, leaving a couple by the holy well for an extra quarter hour. Others were less forgiving, like the friar in Lübeck who interrupted a whispered conversation behind the rood screen by banging his staff on the floor until the pair jumped apart. He later worked the episode into a sermon about idle tongues. There were risks. A court case from a 15th century Norwich records a fine for unseemly conduct in the bell tower after Compline. The couple claimed they were looking for a missing psalter. The judge dryly noted that psalters were not usually kept under the skirts of the plaintiff. Still, fines were rare. Most people preferred to shake their heads and let small indiscretions stay buried. Rural chapels, those small, often unattended buildings, were the most dangerous and the most tempting. In Devon, a Hayward and his wife met regularly in the half-ruined chapel by the stream. They said they went to clear brambles, and indeed the brambles did vanish, though the rest of the ruin remained untouched. An elderly neighbour told her granddaughter the place was haunted. The granddaughter later discovered the haunting was just the sound of boots on stone and laughter in the dark. Even the act of giving alms could become cover. A husband might offer coins to the poor at the church steps, and while the crowd pressed forward, his wife could slip away to the cloister walk. He would follow with the slow dignity of a man who had done a good deed. The poor never minded. They got their coins and the couple got their moment. Sacred spaces carried a weight of their own. Some couples felt daring, almost guilty, for bending them to worldly purposes. Others felt protected by the walls themselves, convinced that nothing said in a church could turn against them later. In either case, the building, the yard, and the road to it were part of the hidden map of their lives. By the time the doors closed at night, the saints and angels on the walls had seen more than they were carved to understand. And in the hush before the next day's prayers, the lingering warmth on a stone bench or the faint scent of bread on the air might be the only trace left of words and touches the world would never know. A carved spoon could say what the mouth dared not. In a village near Ghent, a young husband spent nights at the hearth whittling handles with patterns that made no sense to anyone but his wife. A swirl meant, "Remember our walk by the mill." A notch under the bowl meant, "Meet me after sunset." She used the spoon in public, and no one noticed the secret messages clinking in the porridge. Embroidery was even safer. A wife could stitch a row of tiny flowers into a cuff, daisies for innocence, violets for devotion, knowing her husband's friends would only see it as decoration. In York, a tailor's wife used alternating green and red threads in her husband's shirt cuffs. Green for yes, red for soon. He claimed to have worn the same shirt at least 3 market days in a row for luck. Wooden boxes were common gifts for storing pins or spices. In Bristol, a cooper carved a small compartment in the bottom of one for his wife, just large enough for a folded scrap of parchment. Sometimes it held a line of verse, other times a pressed herb leaf with a scent only they shared the memory of. Years later, when their granddaughter found the box, the compartment still rattled faintly with something too faded to read. Belt buckles and strap ends could be quietly personal. A smith in Norwich, making a buckle for his wife's work belt, hammered a tiny heart on the underside, never seen unless the belt was taken off. She joked that he was branding her, but wore it every day. The mark outlasted both the leather and the marriage, ending up in a midden heap where some future digger might think it just a decorative flourish. You sit at the workbench, shavings curling away under your knife. The smell of fresh wood is sharp and sweet. Beside you, your partner leans over to pass a tool, their sleeve brushing yours. In that brief contact, the carved pattern under your hand seems suddenly more alive. Even food could carry messages. Bakers sometimes scored loaves with more than just practical cuts. A double curve in the crust could be a private sign, especially if given warm into the other's hands. In Bruges, a baker's wife marked a single loaf each week for her husband, sending it to him at the quay among the bread for sale. The mark was small, just a curve crossing another, but he claimed the bread always tasted sweeter. Pottery offered both permanence and fragility. A potter in Lincoln scratched tiny initials under the glaze of a jug he gave his wife. She used it for ale, smiling whenever she lifted it. Years later, the jug cracked in winter frost. She kept the shards in a cloth bag in her chest. The initials still visible if you knew where to look. Clothing repairs were another code. A patched shirt could have its stitches set in a rhythm only 2 people knew. 3 short, 1 long, 3 short. A shepherdess in Devon mended her husband's tunic this way, telling him, "Now you're stitched to me." He wore it thin before agreeing to a new one. Some gestures were almost theatrical. In Florence, a dyer once presented his wife with a scarf dyed in a shade of blue he claimed was only for her. The truth, he had mixed the dye using water from a fountain where they'd first met. The scarf faded in sunlight, but she folded it carefully in the dark of their chest after each wear. Metalwork had its own secrecy. Pewter spoons or brooches could hide marks inside the curve or clasp. A tinsmith in Canterbury engraved a line from a love song in Lombardic script along the inside of a brooch pin. Only when it was unfastened could the words be read. His wife claimed to wear it to keep my cloak on, but the clasp often came loose when no one was looking. Leather goods made space for messages too. A cobbler in Lubeck sewed a thin strip of parchment into the lining of a boot for his wife. The ink faded to ghost grey by the time anyone else saw it. She wore the boots until the soles were thin as paper, then tucked them in the rafters above their bed. Even mundane tools could be shaped for meaning. In a fishing village, a man carved the handle of his wife's net mender with the pattern of the tide that had been running the night they first kissed. It was a simple curve of high and low, repeated again and again, worn smooth by years of her hands. Neighbours sometimes guessed at these exchanges. A gossip in Kent once remarked that a certain wife had more stitching than sense because her husband's shirts were patched with silk. What she didn't know was that the silk came from a piece of the bride dress she'd worn to the church years before. Sometimes the meaning wasn't even in the object itself, but in the act of giving it. A man might stop by his wife's weaving frame in the middle of the day, hand her a shuttle he'd polished smooth, and leave without a word. She would understand it as surely as if he'd whispered a promise. By the time these objects wore out, broke, or were given away, their secret lives were already lived. The carved spoons, the marked bread, the hidden initials, all part of a language visible only to two people, spoken in wood, thread, clay, and metal. And even when the items were gone, the grammar remained, ready to be used again in the next thing made by hand. The air in the longhouse is thick with the smell of smoke, wool, and the day's sweat. Grandparents lie nearest the hearth, wrapped in blankets patched so many times the seams look like a map. Children sprawl in a tangle of limbs beside them, their breathing deep and uneven. At the far end, against the wall, a couple lies side by side, not touching, yet the space between their hands is charged, each aware of the other's smallest movement. In a fisherman's cottage on the coast, the bed is just a frame of driftwood with straw piled high, the mattress covered by a coarse linen sheet. At its foot, a dog sleeps curled around two chickens, their warmth welcome in the damp air. The couple shares the bed with the husband's younger brother, who snores loud enough to make the walls hum. They wait until he rolls away before they risk letting their legs brush under the covers. A manor hall has more bodies than furniture. Servants sleep on pallets by the door, guards take turns at the threshold, and the lord and lady's curtained bed sits raised on a dais. The curtains do not block sound. In the hush between the logs collapsing in the fire, someone coughs. Someone shifts in straw. Inside the bed, a soft laugh is smothered against a shoulder. You lie on your side, the weight of the shared blanket pressing you toward the warm shape beside you. Somewhere in the dark, a baby fusses, the sound quickly soothed by a mother's murmur. The smell of tallow from the candle stub lingers in your nose. When the person next to you moves, their breath ghosts across your neck. The room is too crowded for words, but not too crowded for meaning. In a weaver's home in Bruges, the loom stands silent in the corner at night. Its frame hides a narrow space between it and the wall, just wide enough for two people to stand. The couple living here uses it often. At bedtime, they settle on their straw pallet like everyone else. Hours later, they slip into the gap for a whispered conversation, pretending to check the loom's tension if anyone stirs. Some couples make games of concealment. A farmer in Kent sleeps with his arm flung over his wife's hip, pretending to be fully asleep if anyone passes by. She does the same with her feet, curling them around his ankles under the blanket, knowing no one will notice. These small contacts are enough to carry them through weeks when there is no chance of more. In a Paris tenement, rooms are stacked above each other, sound carrying through thin floors. A young couple lives under a widowed aunt who is quick to gossip. They learn to keep their movements so quiet that the only sound in the night is the creak of the bed frame when they shift to get comfortable. The aunt never hears enough to report, but sometimes smiles too knowingly at breakfast. In some homes, bedfellows are strangers. Inns, especially on market nights, often forced unrelated travellers into the same bed. A husband and wife might find themselves sharing with another couple, or worse, a single drunk who smelled of the alehouse. In these cases, any closeness had to be coded in a glance, a squeeze of the hand under the blanket, or a shared smile over the stranger's snores. Even in noble houses, privacy is not what it seems. Pages sleep in the antechamber, ladies in waiting in the corner of the room. Curtains are drawn, voices lowered, but the rustle of movement behind fabric is still audible. Those who serve pretend not to hear. Those in the bed pretend not to notice the pretense. A shoemaker's family in Lübeck all sleep on a raised platform to keep clear of the cold floor. The parents lie in the centre, children around them like spokes of a wheel. In winter, everyone piles under the same heavy quilt, and the weight of it hides the small shift of a hand beneath. Once their eldest daughter remarked on the quilt, shaking by itself. The parents claimed it was the dog moving at their feet. In a shepherd's hut high on the moors, the wind rattles the shutters and whistles through the gaps in the walls. The couple sleeps on a thick bed of heather, the scent of it rising each time they move. Sheep huddle in the corner, their warmth a living wall. The only light is from embers in a clay brazier. In the half-dark, the couple's faces are close enough to share breath without speaking. Even illness can shift the sleeping order. When one child is sick, they are placed closest to the fire, the parents moving beside them for the night. Sometimes this rearrangement gives the couple a rare position in the room where they can curl together with fewer eyes on them. No one comments. Everyone understands the logic of warmth and watchfulness. Morning always comes too soon. Light seeps through cracks and shutters. Footsteps begin in the yard. Roosters crow. Couples uncurl, straighten their clothes, and let their faces settle into the expressions of another day. Whatever passed in the night, be it a glance, a breath, or something more, becomes part of the unspoken ledger they carry between them. Sleeping under one roof meant learning the art of sharing space without giving everything away. It was about knowing when the rustle of straw would be drowned out by the crack of a log in the fire, when a shadow fell just right to hide a movement, when the shift of a blanket could be mistaken for turning over. The whole house became a stage, and the bed, whether curtained, crowded, or bare, was the one place where the smallest gestures could speak louder than anything said aloud. The first drop hit the thatch with a hollow pop, then another, then dozens, until the whole roof hummed with it. In the yard, chickens scattered under carts, and children dashed for the doorway, squealing. Inside, the sounds swallowed smaller noises. In one cottage, a wife leaned close to speak in her husband's ear, her words hidden beneath the drumming above. In another, a couple slipped out to fetch the washing and vanished behind the smokehouse, until the shower passed. The rain ran off the eaves in sheets, no one noticing two damp figures returning later, cheeks warm despite the chill. Snow muffled the village, boots crunched and disappeared in the whiteness. Voices seemed to come from far away. On days when drifts rose against doors, no one expected much work to be done outside. In a merchant's home in Lübeck, a couple claimed they needed to check the roof for weight. They climbed to the loft, closed the hatch, and sat together under the slanted rafters. The cold seeped in quickly, so they pulled wool blankets tight around both their shoulders. The world outside fading to a dim, snow-lit blur through the cracks in the boards. The marsh fog came in low and thick, turning the road to the mill into a pale corridor. Shapes passed like ghosts, neighbours, travellers, sometimes just a cow wandering loose. In the mist, distance became hard to judge. Couples walked side by side, their hands brushing without witnesses. One widow and her suitor used fog days to meet halfway between their houses, claiming they couldn't see each other's doors from the path. The fog didn't last long, but long enough for an exchange of words no one else would hear. When the air in the cottage grew too hot to bear, people spilled into courtyards, porches, or under shade trees. Work slowed, conversations drifted. In a manner's orchard, the lady pretended to inspect the apple crop, while her husband strolled beside her. The dappled light hid their expressions, and the buzzing of bees covered the rise and fall of low voices. Farther down the lane, a tenant couple carried buckets of water to the well at the slowest possible pace, stopping at every patch of shade. Their neighbours were too busy fanning themselves to notice. A gale off the coast rattled shutters and flapped every loose cloth in the yard. Laundry day became an ordeal, sheets whipping like sails, pegged skirts tugging at their pins. For one pair in a fishing village, the chaos was useful. They worked side by side to wrestle a stubborn sheet from the line, their bodies pressed close against the wind's force. Each gust let them lean harder, without raising suspicion. When at last the sheet was down, they held it between them like a sail, grinning in the sudden calm it made. The sudden spring rain was softer than summer storms, more likely to be laughed at than cursed. In Kent, a young couple walking home from market pretended to run for cover, ducking into the lee of a barn. They stayed longer than the rain lasted, letting the drops slide off the eaves while they talked. Across the fields, another pair returned to their sheep, clothes damp but eyes bright. The lambs, bleating in the distance, were the only witnesses. Autumn storms arrived with thunder that made children run to the hearth. In Bruges, a carpenter's wife used these nights to tell her husband long stories, her voice low enough to be theirs alone. The rumble outside hid the small sounds of their shared seat on the bench. Upstairs in a loft, a couple pulled their straw mattress closer to the wall, the slanting rain drumming on the tiles above. Between thunderclaps, they murmured about the winter ahead. When frost gripped the road, people stayed indoors unless the work was urgent. Couples used the excuse of checking the storehouse or breaking ice at the well to slip outside. The cold air sharpened every breath, but also gave reason to huddle close. A farmer and his wife in Devon once claimed they needed to clear ice from the barn trough. Neighbours saw no harm in it. The pair returned an hour later, cheeks flushed, the trough still frozen solid. You stood under the eaves, rain misting your hair, the air rich with the smell of wet earth and smoke from damp wood. The yard was empty. Beside you the warmth of another body cut through the chill, and the world beyond the falling water might as well not have existed. Weather gave couples cover, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. It was an unspoken understanding. When the sky changed, so did the rules. A sudden downpour could make the busiest yard empty. A blanket of snow could slow the whole day, and a hot afternoon could scatter people into shade. Nature, indifferent to gossip or propriety, offered spaces no door could close and no curtain could draw. The wise knew to use them. The house had fallen silent hours ago, yet the stillness felt alive. The air held the faint, mingled scents of straw, wool, and the fire's last breath. Somewhere in the dark a beam creaked as it cooled. A dog shifted against the door, its claws clicking softly on the wood. The couple lying side by side had not moved in some time. They didn't need to. It had been like this for years. The same one-room space, the same closeness of bodies, not all their own, the same nightly negotiation between what could be shown and what must be hidden. They had mastered it, sometimes without realising. A turn of the head at the right moment. A hand stilled just before it would have been noticed. A smile aimed into the shadows. Theirs was a love shaped by constraints, honed to survive under the eyes and ears of an entire household. These quiet nights were not about urgency. That belonged to stolen market day minutes, to hurried steps behind a barn, to the restless energy of spring. Now in the darkness there was no rush. The fire's heat seeped slowly into the wool blanket, into their skin. Breath and heartbeat matched until the border between one and the other seemed to fade. Years of living this way had taught them that love did not always need grand gestures. It could live in a touch under the table, in a look across a field, in the deliberate choice to walk home together when the road was long. Even the smallest moment, if guarded well, could hold its own kind of permanence. They had weathered seasons like markers in a private calendar. The winter nights when snow muffled the village and made the air outside sharp enough to draw them closer under the covers. The spring rains that emptied the yard, giving them reason to linger under the eaves. The heat of summer that sent the rest of the household seeking shade, leaving certain corners to them. The autumn storms that masked the smallest sounds with the steady drum of rain. They had learned to turn everything into a kind of language. The shape of a loaf scored differently. The pattern in the cuff of a shirt. The carving on the handle of a spoon. Ordinary things took on meaning no one else could read. It was not simply affection. It was resilience, a decision to keep their bond alive in whatever form the day allowed. You sit in the quiet with them now, as if you have always been there. The glow of the embers is soft enough that your eyes have to adjust to see the outline of their faces. You can hear the low hum of the wind beyond the walls. In this moment, nothing feels rushed. The weight of the world, the work, the cold, the noise, has retreated, leaving only this thin layer of peace. Such moments were not rare because of lack of love, but because of life itself. The demands of a shared home, the constant presence of others, the unspoken rules of propriety. These did not leave much room for privacy, but they also did not make it impossible. For those willing to look for it, intimacy could be found in plain sight, in the everyday rhythm of survival. The couple shifts under the blanket, just enough for their legs to touch. The contact is nothing to the casual eye, but between them it carries the weight of memory, of the first time they dared it, of the times they were almost caught, of the unspoken vow they renew without words. Around them the room sleeps on, unaware or unwilling to disturb the quiet spell. Outside, the moon climbs higher, silvering the edge of the roof. Tomorrow will bring noise and labour again. There will be bread to bake, animals to tend, neighbours to greet, small talk to make. There will be no guarantee of a moment like this. And yet, they have learned to trust that it will return in one form or another. A shared glance over a market stall, a walk home in the fog, a touch hidden in shadow. The last ember dims to a faint red pulse, then fades. The blanket shifts one final time before stilling. In the dark, they do not sleep right away. They lie awake for a few breaths longer, holding on to the warmth, not only of the bed, but of the quiet knowledge that, in a world with so little space for secrecy, they have managed to keep something entirely their own. It is not grand, this love. It does not demand witness or flourish. It is built from fragments, a curve of a hand, the brush of a knee, a whispered word disguised as something else. But in its quiet persistence, it is stronger than the walls around them, older than the fire, and as constant as the turning of the seasons. And that, in the end, is vow enough.